So thank you so much for having me today talk about bee nutrition. So my topic today is obviously talking about the very basics of honeybee nutrition. How can we keep healthy bees, what it means to have healthy hives, and truly the power of proper nutrition. When we talk about the different stressors that are affecting honeybees, this is essentially what we are looking at. We have pests, parasites, pathogens, poor nutrition, diseases, climate change, pesticides, whatnot. All of these stressors are either acting alone or they are interacting with each other to cause further stress. And this is primarily what we study in my lab. We are really interested in understanding not only how these individual stressors are impacting bees, but also how are they interacting with each other so that we can counteract and mitigate such stress. So just as an overview, we certainly study bee nutrition. We look at the nutrients in the landscape and also how these nutrients shape colony health and bee health. We also study the impacts of pesticides on bees. We look at the impacts of the environment on individual bee and colony health. And as I mentioned before, we also look at the multi-stressor interactions. How are these different stressors impacting bees as a whole? Because when you're looking at the landscape, all of these stressors, they really do not impact the bee one at a time. You might have a bee which is exposed to poor nutrition stress at the same time under mite pressure or has been exposed to pesticides. So which is why it is really important that we look at the interactive impacts as well. And we not only study the individual honeybee, but we also look at the overall colony effect. We study their colony health. We look at their brain, their behavior, their gut microbiome, their physiology. We really look at all of that story. We want to look at that holistic story to be able to understand what's happening and how can we help you keep better and healthy bees. So for this talk specifically, as I mentioned, I'm only going to focus on nutrition. I will not be talking about any research today, but just the very simple basics of bee nutrition. When it comes to nutrition, we know that it is very important because no matter which organism you're looking at, nutrition helps us sustain ourselves. When we are looking at it from a honeybee perspective, though, nutrition is extremely complex because we are looking at the colony needs, we are looking at the individual needs, we are looking at the needs of the different castes. What does a queen need versus a drone versus a worker? We are also looking at their life cycle stages. Is it a larva? Is it an adult? Is it a nurse honeybee? Is it a worker honeybee? So we are also looking at their ages, which is why it becomes multi-layered and multifaceted. Studies have shown that nutrition is the first line of defense because well-fed colonies can fight off other stressors better. They have better immunity, they live longer, they are healthier, and they are able to counteract different types of stress. So having access to optimal nutrition is extremely important for a honeybee colony. And we all know that for honeybees, nutrition also determines the castes. So a diploid having the full double set of chromosomes, a diploid female larva, if she's fed royal jelly throughout the larval period, she becomes a queen. If she switched to a different diet of worker jelly, she becomes a worker. So essentially, it's also the difference in the nutrition that also determines the castes. But most importantly, even though nutritional stress is an important factor in colony losses, it is still not thoroughly investigated. It is only over the last few years that we've truly started looking at the impacts of poor nutrition as an important stressor. When we talk about the different nutrients that honeybees need, we can broadly categorize them as macronutrients and micronutrients. Macronutrients, as the name suggests, are required in larger amounts, and they are obviously very important for bees. So examples include proteins that come in from pollen, major lipids also from pollen, and carbohydrates that nectar produces, or rather nectar and honey if it is stored in the colony as honey. And then we have another group of nutrients called micronutrients. They are as important as the macronutrients. They are just required in smaller amounts. Examples include phytochemicals, vitamins, minerals, salts, and phytosterols. And these are all derived from both pollen and nectar. During a particular foraging trip, a honeybee forager will commit to any one resource in the landscape and is going to continue to forage for it. So pollen is quite often collected. It is said that approximately a colony having 20,000 honeybees can collect up to 125 pounds of pollen annually. But we must remember, for this to happen, that colony must have brood present throughout the year, and the colony should also be in a location where there is constantly something or the other that is blooming, which is providing them with pollen. And as we know, it is not always the case, which is why towards the end of my presentation today, I'm also going to focus on supplemental feeding. Nectar, just like pollen, is also quite often collected. It is estimated that a worker bee needs about 11 milligrams of dry sugar per day, and a colony with about 50,000 honeybees approximately needs about 700 pounds of sugar per year. If you look at the average flower nectar, it is obviously less than 50% sugar. So just looking at the sheer number of flowers that the bees have to visit, it is an improbable number. There is not enough forage in the landscape. And there is not enough number of flowers with the enough amount of sugars that is present, which is why, going back to it, providing supplemental feeding is important. And let us not forget water. Water is extremely important. Foragers will prefer compound-rich water, especially when they're looking for minerals in hot, dry summers when pollen is scarce. So water is as important as pollen and nectar, even though they may not be as often collected as the other two. When we are looking at the landscape, there are many ways that bees can be nutritionally challenged. There could be a lack of pollen abundance. The quantity of pollen that is coming in is not enough. There could also be a lack of pollen diversity. The bees are only bringing in just one type of pollen. Just think about what you had for dinner tonight. If you think about your plate, you had a diverse diet. You probably had a mix of different proteins, different types of maybe fruits, vegetables, carbs, healthy fats, and so on. So if you think about your diet on a regular basis, you try and have a diverse diet to make sure you're getting all the nutrients you need. And bees are just the same. They need a diverse diet, diversity in both pollen and nectar, to be able to source all the macro and micronutrients that they need. There could also be a lack of pollen quality. Some of our studies have shown that plants such as blueberries or hybrid carrot seeds, their pollen quality is not as high as maybe some of the tree fruits, their flower pollen. So essentially, a lack of pollen quality could also impose nutritional stress. And let us not forget nectar. An insufficient nectar flow in the landscape will stress the colonies out. At the end of the year, essentially, our main goal is to make sure that our colonies are able to successfully overwinter. So the overwintering workers, what we call as diutinous bees, need to have enough nutrients stored within their body tissues that they're going to burn off throughout the overwintering months. The colony should also have enough food reserve to last the overwintering months. Everything that the honeybee needs is present in this flower, in its pollen, in its nectar. We just need to make sure that these are the three key aspects of the habitat that we are paying attention to. It should be a diverse habitat. Something or the other should always be blooming in the habitat, what we call a staggered bloom. And there should also be an abundant forage in the habitat. We know that unless, for example, we plant, say, 300 acres of maybe Dutch white clover or red clover, we are really not going to be able to support a ton of colonies per se. But every little bit helps support the bees in terms of their nutrition. anything that we can do within our backyard, within our scope of being able to plant and plan ahead for providing a diverse, staggered, and abundant forage habitat for bees, it will all be paid off when the bees have access to a good nutrition source there in the landscape. So going back to this, as I mentioned, I said that foragers will commit to either pollen or nectar or water sometimes in the landscape, and they're going to continue to look for it for that individual foraging trip. There was actually a paper way back in 1989 by Robinson and Page, which described how there could be a genetic determination of nectar foraging, pollen foraging, and nest site scouting in honeybee colonies. It is as if they are genetically told what they are supposed to be collecting in that colony. So let's look at pollen first. Pollen obviously provides the colony with the protein that they need for growth. Pollen also, in addition, provides lipids, vitamins, minerals, and also phytosterols. In a typical colony, it's the pollen forager who goes out and she's packing all that pollen in her hind leg pollen basket or corbicula. She's bringing it back to the colony and she's storing it as bee bread. The nurse bees then consume it. Nurse bees have very hyperactive hypopharyngeal glands in their head region. So these glandular secretions produce brood food for the worker larvae. Nurse bees also have mandibular glands in their mouthpart region. These two glands together produce royal jelly. We had published a paper back in 2020 or 2019. No, I believe 2020 or 2021, where we actually found that if the colonies were exposed to pesticides by feeding them contaminated pollen paddy, the nurse bees were actually producing royal jelly that was of inferior nutritional quality that the queen larvae was then being reared on. So it is really important, going back to my very first slide, how we look at these different factors and tie them with poor nutrition. Because at the end of the day, pollen and nectar are very crucial for the colony to sustain, and anything else that impacts the colony can trickle down to poor nutrition stress. So I did mention bee bread. What is bee bread? In very simple terms, bee bread is the pollen that honeybee foragers collect and they store it in the hive. But truly, the composition of this bee bread will vary depending on the source of the pollen from which it is made. When the bees are packing pollen in their corbiculae, they are mixing a bit of nectar and their salivary secretions. So bee bread, essentially, its average composition has about 40 to 60% simple sugars, 20 to 60% proteins, 3% about minerals and vitamins, 1 to 32% fatty acids, and about 5% diverse components. Bee bread also harbors important yeasts and bacteria for the colony. Looking at nectar. Nectar is the main source of carbohydrate, or rather the only natural source of carbohydrate for the colonies. Nectar provides energy mainly in the form of sucrose. Nectar also has trace amino acids as well as phytochemicals such as phenols, flavonoids, and alkaloids. Nectar has a lot of minerals, and the darker the color of the honey, the higher the mineral content in the nectar from which the honey was made. Nectar is eventually converted to honey and is stored in the capped cells in the hive until the honeybees themselves, or we as beekeepers, we are ready to consume it. Plants which have high nectar in their flowers, for example, include alfalfa, sweet clover, canola, and blackberry. Low nectar quantity flowers are watermelon and hybrid plants, and then there are also some no nectar flowers, such as drought-stressed plants or wind-pollinated plants. So circling back to what we eat, if you look at this picture, what do you think it is? Proteins, either animal-based or plant-based, but you're essentially looking at proteins. That same concept from a honeybee colony perspective looks like this. If you look at the picture to the very top right corner where my cursor is, that really tells you how diverse the bee's habitat is because of the different colored pollen grains that the honeybee foragers have brought back to the colony. So in terms of a diversity in diet, this is what we are looking for when we are looking at a honeybee colony. What colors are the different bee bred pellets? The more the different colors, the more it will tell you that they are coming from different plant sources. So proteins are important building blocks. They are built with long chain folded amino acids, and they usually range between 2.5% to 61% dry weight across a plant pollen. If you are ever to build your own protein substitute, 20% protein is a good percentage to start building those pollen substitutes. I have just listed some commercial diets that are currently available in the market. This is not an exhaustive list on this slide. And a lot of times the crude protein percentages also change depending on what type of products you're looking at. But as I mentioned, that the main source of protein for the honeybee naturally is the pollen, like the main source of energy for the honeybees is carbohydrates that come in from nectar. So D. Groot, in 1953, he had first given us the proportions of the 10 essential amino acids that honeybees need. So you have arginine, histidine, isoleucine, leucine, lysine, methionine, phenylalanine, threonine, tryptophan, and valine. These are the 10 essential amino acids. And the way you can look at this table is, for example, if you look at the second to last name, tryptophan from the very bottom, you see that required proportion is 1. So for every 1 tryptophan, you need 3 of arginine, 1.5 of histidine, 4 of isoleucine, 4.5 of leucine, and so on. When you're looking at a bee's habitat or forage, these 10 essential amino acids are obviously very important to be present in the pollen. But even if they are not present in the perfect proportions, in the right ratios, it does not matter as long as we have at least little bits and pieces of everything. Something is better than nothing at all when you're looking at the bee's habitat. Moving on to carbohydrates, sugars are collected from nectar and they are stored as honey. Bees can digest glucose, fructose, sucrose, and trehalose. Trehalose is actually a honeybee's blood sugar equivalent. Bees cannot digest starch and dextrins, and sugars such as lactose, galactose, and raffinose are poisonous for bees. When we are providing fructose, though, we should watch out for hydroxymethylfurfuryl or HMF, and I'll talk about it in the next slide. Carbohydrate in the form of nectar, it is stored in crops, it is regurgitated, it is mixed with sucrase and other enzymes, and it is stored in cells. Finally, the water is evaporated to form honey, and it happens in 6 simple steps. The foragers are collecting the nectar and they're storing it in honey crop or in their honey stomach. While they are bringing that nectar back to the hive, the enzymes have already started working. Back in the hive, the older foragers, they regurgitate out that nectar to younger workers. These younger workers then continue to process it with their enzymes. Eventually, when about the right level of dehydration has reached, the sugar, sucrose in that nectar is broken down into fructose and glucose. The pH is also acidic. The bees then finally deposit this into cells. They further fan it to dehydrate it. This honey is then capped, and the whole process can even take up to 45 days. So going back to hydroxymethylfurfuryl, I mentioned that if we are providing bees with invert sugar, for example, adding cream of tartar or citric acid to the sugar syrup, or if we are overheating high fructose corn syrup, we have a risk of producing hydroxymethylfurfuryl as a synthetic byproduct. Hydroxymethylfurfuryl is also called HMF. It is the fructose component of the sugar which is more susceptible to forming HMF. HMF can also form when honey or regular syrup is heated or stored at warmer temperatures for a prolonged period of time. Studies have shown that HMF above 30 parts per million, it's not much, above 30 parts per million is toxic for honeybees. When honeybees are breaking down the sugars in nectar, they're doing it naturally, biologically, using enzymes. When we do this chemically, HMF is a dangerous toxic synthetic byproduct which is produced, which is why we must be careful when we are dealing with different types of sugar supplements. So you're looking at 2 jars of honey. What is the obvious difference that you see? The one on the left has crystallized, the one on the right is still clear. And I do teach honeybee biology to both graduate and undergraduate students here. And when I show them this picture, a lot of students often tell me, oh, the honey on the left has gone bad. The one on the right is clear. It's not bad. It's just crystallized and clear honey. The difference is the honey on the left has high glucose content. The honey on the right has high fructose content. So nectar, for example, goldenrod nectar, it will have high glucose content and the honey will crystallize faster. Nectar from flowers such as linden, that honey has high fructose content, so it will crystallize slowly. Lipids, they are another important macronutrients and they are still under investigated. For a long time, when it came to understanding bee nutrition, we've been focusing on proteins and carbohydrates. And rightfully so, because bees need a lot of proteins and a lot of carbohydrates to keep them going. But when you're looking at lipids, when you're looking at the other micronutrients, all of these nutrients are as equally important. Lipids in pollen range from anywhere between 1 to 20%. And then you're also breaking down lipids into, for example, saturated fats, organic fatty acids, and terpenoids. So the picture that you see here, the one on the left is a forager honeybee. The one on the right here is a nurse bee. The picture shows you a cross-section of the honeybee's abdomens. The white cloudy mass that you see to the right in the nurse bee is actually fat body. So the fat body is like a storehouse of nutrients for bees. And look at how lean the forager is. So when you're truly thinking about what their functions are in the colony, nurse bees, and also the overwintering workers, actually, they need to store a lot of nutrients in their body tissues. But the foragers, on the other hand, they are lean. They mostly consume nectar or honey because they need all the energy they can get to be able to go out and get the necessary forage. And last but not the least, we should also think about the other micronutrients. Bees need a lot of different salts and minerals, vitamins, phytochemicals, phytosterols, phenolic acids, and organic acids, for example. And I will touch upon phytosterols because I do a lot of work on phytosterols. And it is important that we understand that all insects are sterol auxotrophs, which essentially means that they cannot biosynthesize their own sterols. So they are all dependent on their diets to source these sterols. And you may ask me, why are we so concerned about phytosterols? It is because sterols are very important components of the insect cellular membrane, and sterols are also precursors for important insect hormones, such as molting hormones. All bees are insects, so they are also sterol auxotrophs. Pollen is the only natural source of phytosterols. And if we are just looking at honeybees, 24-methylene cholesterol, or 24-MC, is the key phytosterol that honeybees require. And a lot of our studies have shown that having about 0.5% dry diet weight of 24-methylene cholesterol is a good value in an artificial diet if we must if we are careful about adding phytosterols and the value that we must provide to make sure that bees have these critical micronutrients. So I just wanted to show you this graphics, this video, to tell you why sterols are important. Think of this yellow grain as pollen grain, and as I mentioned, it has an abundance of phytosterols. So when the nurse honeybees are consuming pollen, they are also selectively taking up these phytosterols within their body tissues as endogenous sterols. They can then pass these endogenous sterols to the growing larva through brood food. The larvae now have sterols, they can produce molting hormones, and you see successive generations of bees. Imagine this scenario where you have an artificial diet, a protein supplement that lacks these critical phytosterols. So even if the nurse bees are consuming it, after a point of time, there are no new sterols to replace the endogenous sterols. So no sterols in the larvae, going through brood food, no molting hormones, and that is where we see a gap. Which is why, even though you need a tiny amount of micronutrients such as phytosterols, they are very important and they must be present in a bee's diet. There are also important phytochemicals such as p-coumaric acid, camphophyrol, and quercetin, for example. A lot of studies have shown that they improve honeybee longevity, they reduce nosema spore loads, they also enhance bee tolerance to toxicity. In fact, p-coumaric acid is actually present in worker jelly, not in royal jelly, because it helps suppress worker ovary development. So there are many ways that these phytochemicals can be critical for a honeybee colony's overall health and overall growth. So circling back to what I told you about water, let us not forget water. As much as we are concerned about pollen and nectar, water is also important. This video that you actually see here playing is from my research apiary on campus at Mississippi State. I run this water fountain. Obviously, I love this design because it just resembles a skip. But this water fountain, if you look at it, it has been very thoughtfully placed here. I run this water fountain from the last frost of the year to the first frost of the year. And Mississippi can get pretty hot, so I just run it from the last frost to the first frost. It is right there where my on-campus research apiary is. The steps are cut onto the sides, so the bees have a landing surface and they are not going to drown. The pool at the bottom is pretty shallow actually, and we have some pebbles that we have thrown in there. We do not clean it out, so there is enough moss and other things growing which can provide bees with nutrients. In addition, it is a gentle stream of flowing water, so we then don't have to worry about mosquito larvae. All we have to do is plug it in and just let it run from the last frost to the first frost. You could also do something very similar by just putting a container with pebbles in it and putting some water in there. Make sure the water dries out completely before you pour in fresh water, just to avoid mosquito larvae. So water is obviously needed for hydration. It is needed for cooling. It is also used by bees for reliquefying crystallized honey. In fact, during times of pollen dearth, foragers will prefer compound-rich water because they're looking for minerals. So you can often find them in moss beds, in agricultural runoffs, swimming pools, and so on. This is another video of my on-campus research apiary. So you can see the water fountain, but what I wanted to show you is this is just this video. I took it about a week ago. This is what I was talking about, having diverse, staggered, and abundant bloom. You can see the research apiary right there. We only keep anywhere between 16 to 20 hives on the main campus area, and we keep more hives spread across the research farms and across the state. But this is not the only pollinator garden around our entomology building. This is one of the 4 gardens. But this is something that we can sort of like, think ahead, plan ahead, so that something or the other is constantly blooming from the last frost to the first frost. So 3 very key, I would say, aspects of the bee's habitat: diverse, staggered, and abundant, all within this very small area that you can see. So going back to this, we know that obviously an artificial diet so far will never truly be able to replace pollen because pollen has a variety of macro and micronutrients, and we are still trying to figure out how to incorporate most of it into artificial supplements. Similarly, nectar also has a lot of macro and micronutrients, and just sugar syrup alone will never be truly able to replace nectar. But as important as natural forage is, it is also important to provide supplemental feeding to the colonies because we cannot let the bees die. They would rather have something to eat than starve. And supplemental feeding can be provided either in the form of proteins or in the form of carbohydrates. If you have heard of NAS or National Agricultural Statistical Service reports, the 2023 reports, even if you go back to 2022, this is what you're going to see. The cost of providing supplemental feed to the colony, as reported by the US beekeepers, that cost far supersedes any other cost in beekeeping operation, which includes treatment for varroa. So essentially, beekeepers need to continuously feed their colonies. We are seeing lack of forage, we are seeing lack of floral habitat, we are seeing bees stressed out nutritionally in their landscape, which is why we should be prepared to provide supplemental feeding to the colonies. And as you see, it is no easy feat and it is expensive. And this was one of the reasons why Project APSM, Honeybee Health Coalition, and we got together because we realized there has to be at least a starting point, a one-point resource where you can find out more about bee nutrition, and you can also find out more about the supplemental diets that are currently present that we can use. And this was the nutrition guide that Martha was talking about. So this is the Honeybee Nutrition Supplemental Feeding Guide that we recently published in the January of this year. And if you go through this, I have tried my best to incorporate all aspects of bee nutrition. This is the first version of this guide. So I would be very happy to take any feedback that you have because we are always happy to revise it as and when we have more information about the various aspects of bee nutrition. So this particular guide will not only give you an overview of the macro and micronutrients, but it will also talk about the different ways you can provide supplemental feeding and what we know about the management needs, the probiotics and the prebiotics as well, whatever we know so far. So I mentioned to you about bee bread, how pollen is stored in the colony as bee bread, and bees add nectar to the collected pollen, and they also give it a boost of microbiome. So which is why commercial diets will never be as attractive as multifloral pollen. And these diets, until now, cannot replace pollen for providing optimal nutrition, but they are still important. Pollen patties can be, protein patties can be sold either as pollen-based patties, which are called pollen supplements, or they could also be sold as non-pollen-based patties, which are called pollen substitutes. So if they have pollen mixed in them, it's called a supplement. If it's got no pollen mixed in it, then it is called a substitute. While both pollen supplements and pollen substitutes provide the proteins and lipids that are required by bees, pollen obviously has additional micronutrients. It must be considered, however, that natural pollen can be pretty hard to collect on a large scale basis. And it can also be very, I would say, expensive and difficult to procure on a commercial scale. So not only is it expensive, it may also run the risk of pathogen transmission or pesticide exposure. I buy a lot of bulk commercial pollen because I do a lot of experiments. So I need to make sure I have enough pollen in my freezer to run my experiments on. I certainly buy multifloral pollen. But what I also do for my research apiary itself is that I set out traps during that point of time in spring when I know that my colonies are going to bring in a ton of pollen, just naturally from the landscape. So I choose strong hives and I set out pollen traps 48 hours at a time on bright sunny days. I do not starve a particular colony, but I just kind of move the pollen traps around, selecting the stronger colonies. So all the pollen that I collect from this trapping, I freeze it in my lab chest freezer, and then I mix it back into patties that I feed the colonies during times of pollen dearth. So the thing is that it's easy for me to do on a smaller scale because I do not have a large commercial operation. And this is the pollen that basically the colonies would have consumed anyhow in spring. I'm just giving it to them 2 or 3 months later. So if you have a smaller number of hives, for example, this is something that you could also try. So some research has shown that unlike pollen, commercial diets are not stored in the colony. So when this particular study by Jamie Ellis's lab out of University of Florida has actually shown that these commercial diets, they are only eaten by a proportion of the adult honeybees in the hive. And these patties are not even directly fed to the larvae, and they are not stored in the hive. And traditionally, it is believed that pollen-based supplemental protein patties can be given to stimulate brood production, especially when queens may not lay eggs typically in the season. And we all know when colonies are brought into California, their brood production has to be amped up and they have to be forced out of their brood break cycle. But there are advantages to having winter patties that lack pollen because the queen obviously gets much needed rest from constantly egg laying. Less brood production also leads to fewer workers that are produced in fall and winter. So, which means there are fewer mouths to feed and the colony can conserve food. A small cluster of workers can also stay warm at the center, and a brood break also means a break in the mite cycle. When it comes to supplemental sugar feeding, beekeepers often provide sugar supplements in the form of syrup, which can be made from cane sugar or beet sugar, in the form of granules or fondants, depending on the season and colony needs. And some beekeepers may either directly provide high fructose corn syrup or make invert sugar syrup by adding cream of tartar or citric acid. When it comes to probiotics, there is still very limited understanding. And there was actually a paper by Kirk Anderson's group that was published, which did not show much beneficial effects of the probiotics. Ramesh's lab out of Oregon State, we've also been doing some work on probiotics, and we are finding something similar. But the main problem is that there is limited understanding and a lack of peer-reviewed scientific evidence regarding the beneficial impacts of these commercial probiotics that are sold in the US market. Rather, research has actually shown that if you culture the gut bacteria that are naturally found in honeybee guts, you culture it, and then you feed it back to the honeybees, those seem to have better impacts, beneficial impacts, than just feeding them a random mix of commercial probiotics. But I guess this is still a very relatively new area of research. So perhaps in the next 10 years, we will have more information that is coming in. So I just wanted to kind of dive into nutritionally managing our colonies, starting all the way in spring. Even though we are in fall, I just wanted to start with the beginning of the year. And I found this graphics at some point, I don't even remember when, but I found it in Google. And I love this because as chaotic it is nowhere close to the immense pressure that a beekeeper is under and everything that goes on in a beekeeper's mind, trying to make sure that their colonies stay healthy. So this graphics to my, I would say to my understanding, honestly, does not do justice to everything that goes on in a beekeeper's mind, not just in spring, but throughout the year. So in spring, the colony is obviously expanding. It is raising a workforce and obviously mites. The colony will also be preparing to swarm and foraging will be in earnest. So we can stimulate colonies and we can strengthen them that are coming out of overwintering by feeding them with one-to-one sugar syrup. However, in a lot of regions, the month that they're most likely to starve is February and March. It might get pretty warm. The bees will finish off everything that they have stored in their hives. You start feeding them and they think that, oh, it's spring, it's a little warm, so it's time to forage and build a colony up. Once they start doing that and suddenly a frost sets in or we stop feeding, that hurts the colony. So if we start feeding, we cannot stop till we know for sure there is a nectar flow happening in the landscape. So uninterrupted food supply is very important. And in summer, it's usually the honey season, depending on where we are. Bees are also in winter food storage mode. Let's not forget, water is important in summer. Typically in summer, honey supers should be off by the end of July, no matter where we are. Even in Mississippi, we take off our honey supers by the end of July. This will allow bees to fill the brood box with honey and also leave time for a seasonally effective mite treatment if required. In fall, the colony is preparing fat fall bees to overwinter. These overwintering workers can also survive up to 5 to 6 months. They are fat bees in the sense that they have a lot of nutrients that are stored within their body tissues in their fat bodies. So the colony also need to store enough reserves in the hive, just like within the honeybee tissues. The bees that are emerging in late summer or fall should have adequate reserves in them. Protein must be stored in cells, and the bees are also starting to cluster for warmth. Most importantly, we should be bolstering the colonies to prepare them for overwinter. If the colonies naturally do not have enough honey reserve to overwinter, we should feed them 2-to-1 syrup, a thicker syrup, and use an in-hive feeder. So this will help them build up their overwintering store. We should watch out for the first frost and stop feeding liquid sugar syrup when frost sets in. If additional sugar is necessary, we can opt for granulated sugar or fondant. Generally, during this late fall to winter, bees are generating warmth. They may raise some young depending on where we are. My lab is involved with a project that Auburn University is leading, and we are monitoring brood break across many different states in the US, and we are one of the participating research labs. It is interesting to see how in some parts in the Southeast, the colony is still raising a little bit of brood into late fall, beginning of winter, and that is when we see a brood break that sets in. Colonies way far down south in the Gulf Coast, they may not even get a brood break during a warmer winter. So it really depends on where we are. But assuming that we are going to get a frosty season, it's going to be cold, the colony is going to use up all the honey for food, and they are going to continue clustering in their hives. In winter, there should be adequate population of healthy fat bees or diutinous overwintering honeybees. These workers must have enough nutrition in their body. The colony should have enough food reserve, enough honey stored in the colony. We need to provide some ventilation. If the winters get a little warmer, we need to continue watch for food resources and replenish as needed. If the winters truly get warm, we can revert back to the fall formula of sugar feeding as 2-to-1 syrup. But as beekeepers, our main goal should be that we should leave enough honey in the hive to even start with so that they can overwinter successfully. How much honey is enough in these different regions? To be honest, I would always ask an experienced beekeeper who's been beekeeping in that region for years. They will know exactly how much honey your hive should have, depending on what type of colony demographics you have, what does the winter look like, what's the size of your colony, and so on. So if you're looking at, for example, a frame of larvae, the picture to your left is what typically a well-nourished larva looks like. Look at, they are just white, they are puffy, and they're floating in enough brood food. To your right, on the other hand, is what starved, dry larvae look like. And this is what we are trying to avoid. If they have natural forage, nothing is better than that. If they don't, we have to be able to provide supplemental feeding to the colonies. If the colony comes out from overwintering looking like this, where you have a bunch of dead honeybees, their heads down deep in the cells, and they are frozen dead, or they have frozen and they have died in a cluster, these can be also signs of starvation from a colony perspective. The bees have run out of food, or the food source was minimal and at a far distance away from the cluster. So this is also something that we should try and avoid in terms of a nutritional management perspective. So if you go to the Honeybee Health Coalition, the guide that I talked about, the supplemental feeding guide, towards the end, you're going to see that there are appendices. Some of those list tables that look like these, where we have actually summarized from existing literature what are the different supplemental diets that are sold in the market, which studies have shown there are positive effects or negative effects or neutral effects, what type of positive effects, what type of neutral effects, and so on. So there are these tables that are present in that supplemental nutrition guide, and it's actually taken from one of Jamie Ellis's papers, and all of that is also listed as additional reading and references at the end of the nutrition guide. You will also find another table that looks like this, and these are homemade patties. These are self-formulated protein patties. And similarly, as before, how many studies have shown positive effects? How many have shown neutral effects? How many have shown negative effects, if any? What types of effects are they talking about? So these tables also summarize all of that pretty well. And at the very end, you're also going to find interviews with 6 commercial beekeepers across the US. These beekeepers, they have different beekeeping practices. Some could be pollinating on contract, some could be honey producers or queen breeders. They are spread across different regions, and these really form good case studies, especially for a beginner beekeeper or anybody who's interested in nutritionally managing their colonies, just to look at what would a queen breeder do? What would a honey producer do? What would somebody who is dependent on commercially pollinating a crop do if there is no nectar in the landscape? How are they managing their colonies? What are they feeding their hives? How are they bolstering their colonies? So that guide really kind of digs deep into these real life experiences from very well established and knowledgeable commercial beekeepers. So just a quick recap, all of these is listed in the guide. Everything that I spoke about today and a lot more is there in this guide. In addition, further reading references list some of my papers as well as other papers that I've referred to while putting this guide together. This QR code will also take you to the nutrition guide. It is freely available online. Please reach out to me if you have any feedback, because I will always be happy to sort of revise this as and when we have more information. I just wanted to end by talking about the 2 citizen scientist projects that I am currently leading. And I look at it as my lifelong project. Either I will die or I will retire, but I'm hoping that whichever is sooner, in the next 20, 30 years, whichever is sooner, doesn't matter. But I'm hoping to put enough information out there for anyone to be able to use this freely. To be able to understand what a bee's habitat is, the first database that we are building is the pollen nutrition database for all bees in North America. And we have citizen scientists, volunteers who are spread across the US and Canada. We are looking at pollen proteins, pollen lipids, amino acids, phytosterols, and metabolites. Over the last 3-4 years, we have been able to collect pollen from about 100 different plants, and that includes trees as well as aquatic plants. So if you're interested in contributing pollen for this database, please do reach out to me. The second database that we are building was actually funded to us by Project APICEN. We are building the first ever phenology wheel. Like the nutrition database, this is also a very unique database, and we are building a phenology wheel for pollen in the US. We started it as a regional project in the Southeast, but now we have beekeepers who have signed up or who are willing to sign up across different regions in the US. The beauty of this database is that all of my volunteers are beekeepers. They have a colony in one location for 12 straight calendar months. It doesn't matter if they replace the colony, as long as there is brood and the colony is foraging, that is what our interest is. We ship out pollen traps to our beekeeper volunteers. They trap for pollen for 48 hours once every month. Then they store and freeze everything for us. They label everything for us. If they are close by, we make a drive and we do a road trip and we pick it up, or they ship those samples back to us. But what we are doing is we are cataloging and ground truthing the information. What is blooming in that location? When does it bloom? We know that because honeybee foragers are bringing that back in. What are the major blooms? What are the minor blooms? What do the pollen look like? And what is the nutritional quality of that pollen? I'm hoping to do this at least for 4 straight years, where we switch to a different week each year. So this way we can capture not only the different types of bloom in the habitat, but also we can see if there are any shifts due to climate change, because I also do a lot of work on climate change and bee nutrition. So there are many aspects to this project. Once more, if you're interested in participating in this project as well, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. So with that, I would just like to end by thanking you for having me present my talk today on bee nutrition. Thank you so much for the invitation and the very warm welcome.